think we're live. So, hey everybody, thanks for joining today. My name is Dan Reeser, and I'm joined here by Kevin Welch. We appreciate you taking the time to join today, and hopefully we'll have something that is, interesting to people who are familiar with Polkadot and also people who are familiar with EFF prior to today. So I'm Dan, like I mentioned, I'm from the team at Polkadot, and I work on a lot of community and growth initiatives for the platform. If you're unfamiliar with Polkadot, the team at Polkadot is building a network of multiple blockchains that will work together, and we really think this will be kind of a cornerstone to what we call Web 3.0. So we're trying to solve a lot of problems that previous blockchain networks in the past have had and experienced, and have really hindered the kind of adoption of blockchains. And the reason why we're building this for Web 3.0 is to really work towards an internet where people will have, their power and privacy coming back into the hands of them as individuals, and moving away from kind of the big tech corporate, data manipulation and personal data manipulation that we've seen. So I presented Polkadot to the Austin Blockchain Collective community here in Austin. And Bill, who's on the call today, actually introduced me to Kevin, because Kevin's working on something that overlaps quite a bit with kind of the whole mentality of Web 3.0. So Kevin's president of the EFF Austin organization, and we'll be talking today about the history of net neutrality. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin to introduce himself and his background, and then get into the presentation. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Greetings, everyone. Ignore the hall of mirrors there. That'll go away in just a second. So my name is Kevin Welch. I'm the current president of the board at EFF Austin. For those of you who have not heard of us before, we are a long-standing Austin-based digital civil liberties organization. I think we've been around about 30 years now. We're closely intertwined with the history and founding of Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is based out of San Francisco, EFF Austin. They are the country's foremost digital civil liberties advocacy group. There's a bunch of affiliate groups around the country who are part of what is called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which are a bunch of groups that aren't really chapters or don't really answer to EFF, but are affiliated with them and are committed to similar missions. And EFF Austin has the distinction of being the oldest organization in the alliance. We were founded just shortly after them because we're very intertwined with the legal events that led to the founding of EFF, which makes for a fascinating talk in and of itself. Although one of our co-founders and still member of the board, John Lepkowski, is better at telling that story than I am, because I wasn't around at the time. But anyway, EFF and EFF Austin, we advocate for various issues to protect people's rights in emerging technological spaces. We tend to be guided by the philosophy that technology often moves faster than laws can keep up with technology. So we sort of try to provide that expertise to make sure laws are staying up to date with the ways technology changes how people live. We fight for things like net neutrality, end-to-end encryption, municipal broadband, protecting Section 230 of the CDA, all sorts of good stuff to try to keep the internet the free and open place that you know and love. I was introduced to Dan and Polkadot and their Blockchain 3.0 project through Bill Kleinbecker, who is here in the call. Definitely the stuff Polkadot's working on is very much aligned with our mission. We follow a lot of efforts to try to decentralize the web and make it a more peer-to-peer, personal experience. Certainly we follow various blockchain developments with interest. My interest was especially piqued when I heard that one of the co-founders of Ethereum is very much involved with Polkadot and the Web 3.0 project. So Dan sort of invited me to come out here, both to let those of you who may not know we're a thing in town know we're a thing. Traditionally, we have meetups once a month on the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. Obviously, things are a little in flux right now for everyone. We are exploring options to make our regular meetups entirely virtual, much like this experience. I'm still figuring out the exact form that will take. It may take the form of being crowdcast presentations like this, because this interface seems pretty nifty. But Dan also just thought it'd be good to kind of come and have me give a talk about some of the topics that we at EFF Austin follow, and try to educate some of you on some of these topics, and delve into some of the aspects you may be less familiar with. So I'm going to be giving a presentation I've given several times at this point on the history of net neutrality, sort of the historical and legal precedents that have led to the current debate, and maybe give you a little more insight into when you hear lawmakers and politicians and lobbyists and telecom people talking about this issue, maybe you'll have a little more insight into where all this came from. So, and yes, the window effect is very neat. I'm going to be switching to full screen to my presentation here in just a sec. So without further ado, let me do that. Oh, and also, you all may notice there is a Ask a Question button. If you have a question for me during the presentation, feel free to click that. I'm going to be in full screen and may not immediately see it, but Dan should be watching the questions and should jump in if somebody has a question for me. So let me bring up my slides here, go full screen. Okay, so the title of this talk, as you can see, is Net Neutrality 101. Where freedom on the internet has been and where it is going. So, to start with the term itself, net neutrality. This was a term that was coined by Columbia law professor Tim Wu in a paper a number of years ago that he wrote. I believe it was around 2002, 2003. But yes, Tim Wu is who you have to thank for the idea of net neutrality, and the legal precedents that led up to it. It certainly existed for a long time, but there wasn't really a pithy name for it until Professor Wu coined the term net neutrality in his paper. So let's start with how Tim Wu defines net neutrality. And the first bullet point here is literally a quote from his paper. It is his definition. He defines it as: broadband users have the right reasonably to use their internet connection in ways which are privately beneficial without being publicly detrimental. So the important thing to understand is net neutrality is not a specific policy proposal per se for how the internet should function technologically or legally. It's more an end goal. And it believes that networks like the internet should be agnostic to the purposes for which their users use them. Now, why is this an end goal that is desirable? Well, net neutrality comes out of, and as we talked about in his paper, it comes out of an idea called the evolutionary model of innovation. So there's a lot of theories in academia about the best ways that a society can structure itself to encourage and foster innovation. And one of the popular models is what's known as the evolutionary model of innovation. And it basically says that the best way to get new ideas is to create competition among competing ideas, an intellectual survival of the fittest, if you will. And net neutrality, the idea that a network like the internet shouldn't care about the exact uses the network is being put to, the idea is that you're trying to establish a level playing field so that everyone using the network is on equal footing with the ideas they come up with of how to use the network, so that truly the best ideas can rise to the top, as it were, in a fair, neutral environment. Now, there's a couple of ways in practice to achieve this end goal of net neutrality when it comes to a network like the internet. And they're roughly called open access and broadband discrimination. Now, open access is a solution where you actually allow independent ISPs or internet service providers to access the physical infrastructure of the internet, such as phone lines or cables. It's a physical, or in the OSI model of internet architecture, it's what's called a data link layer solution. In other words, the idea is that anybody who wants to provide internet access to anyone else can actually access the physical wires of the internet and provide access to others to have direct access to those physical wires. The other solution is what's roughly called broadband discrimination. And this is more what you hear when you hear people talking about the current debate around net neutrality. It's what's called, once again, in the OSI model of the internet, it's what's called an application layer solution, where you don't necessarily require that any ISP who wants can access the physical wires, but what you do require is that a bundled cable or ISP provider must not discriminate between the uses to which end users put the network. In other words, existing ISPs that do have access to the network, they don't necessarily have to allow newcomers access to the network, but anybody who they are allowing to access the network through their role as an internet service provider, they can't put rules upon how that person can use the network, i.e. they can't, the actual packets they're sending, the data they're sending over the internet, the ISP can't discriminate based on the content of those packets. They have to treat all those packets equally. And this is more how the debate has evolved on the broadband discrimination side, which I will get into as we go along. But the key thing you need to keep in mind throughout this whole talk, to not get confused, because this stuff can get very wonky and confusing, and I'm trying to keep it accessible, is networks are not the same thing as the contents of networks. That a physical network is not the same thing as the stuff being transmitted or carried through the network. And as long as you keep this distinction in mind, some of the more confusing parts of this will make more sense. But to understand this debate, it really is important to understand the legal history of these concepts, which far predates the internet. And specifically, there is a legal concept in US law called common carriers. And you need to really understand what that is to understand net neutrality. So, what is a common carrier? It is a person or company that transports goods or people for any person or company, and that is responsible for any possible loss of the goods during transport. Now, very importantly, to qualify as a common carrier, you have to accept all clients. You can't discriminate. A lot of businesses say, like, we reserve the right to refuse service for any reason. Well, if you're a common carrier, if you've been granted that legal designation, you don't have that right. You have to, anybody who wants to use your service, they have to be allowed to use it. You also can't charge different prices to different clients. You can't go, oh, this guy has a lot of money, I'm going to charge him more. No, it's a set price for everyone. You also can't charge different prices to ship different products. That relates back to what I was talking about packet discrimination. To be a common carrier, you couldn't charge a different price based on the actual data contained in a packet moving across the internet. You are purely charging per number of packets sent, not what is in the packets. And finally, also the owner of a common carrier. Now, a common carrier can have private ownership, but the owner of a common carrier must allow people who don't have an ownership stake in the network use of the network. The basic idea of a common carrier is that the US, we're traditionally a country and a society that very much respects private property rights. But despite the fact that common carriers are privately owned, when something has been granted common carrier legal status, we're basically saying that in this case, certain public goods trump the private interest of the business in this case, that the common carrier fulfills such a necessary societal function that we're imposing certain rules on how the common carrier can conduct their business. Now, what are some examples of common carriers? Well, there's a lot of them. Taxis, bus lines, railroads, utilities like electricity and water, public airlines, phone companies, internet service providers, oil pipelines, cruise ships, and actually in the state of California, roller coasters are classified legally as a common carrier. Yes, it's true, look it up, but it's legally how they are regulated. So, where do common carriers enter into the history of the United States and United States law? Like, when did they first become a legal concept? You can ultimately really trace it back to the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Now, this law was introduced specifically to curb the monopoly power of railroad companies. So this was a time where railroad networks were proliferating across the United States and across state lines, and they'd become essential to the movement of goods and services throughout the United States. And as you might expect, railroads had an immense amount of power due to this role that they fulfilled in society. Now, railroads were a good example of what is called a natural monopoly. That is where, in a particular market, like railroads, you have a natural monopoly if there is a high cost to enter the market, but once you've entered the market, there is a low marginal cost to serve additional customers. This has been shown in economics, and when you work out the math, there are theories that have shown and proved that when you have a market that is a natural monopoly, a high cost to entry and a low marginal cost for additional customers, this invariably leads to one dominant player controlling the market. So you invariably in markets like this always end up with a monopoly without regulation put in place to curb this from happening. So there's a lot of markets where you don't necessarily need to really pass laws or interfere with them. There's natural competition in that market due to the market dynamics. But markets that display natural monopolies, if you don't create certain regulations, you will always get a monopoly. So what the law did was it told railroads that they had to set reasonable constant rates for all customers. They couldn't charge higher per mile rates for short trips. It also created what was known as the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to regulate the railroads, as well as the burgeoning telephone network, things that involved interstate commerce. Now, as I was already sort of alluding to, most networks are examples of natural monopolies. And this is largely due to the fact that it's the high cost of constructing a network. Networks, to be efficient and function effectively, often require vast numbers of nodes. And they can often, to get into a bit of computer science terminology, they can often get into sort of O(n) squared growth, where the larger an area of service you want to cover, the cost of building the network scales up quadratically. So networks in general, and there can be exceptions, but most networks, they're expensive to construct to make an effective network. So there's always going to be a high cost of entry into a market involving a network. You've probably seen this a bit when you remember the debate around Google Fiber trying to roll out in various cities, that they weren't allowed to use the existing fiber lines of other telecom players, and they had to construct their own networks. And even somebody with the deep pockets of Google, this was immensely expensive. So due to the fact that most networks are natural monopolies, they require some governmental regulatory oversight to ensure a level playing field for those who use the network. So the next piece of this story comes from the Communications Act of 1934. Now, this was similarly motivated by a monopoly problem, specifically in this case, Bell Telephone's monopoly over the nation's growing telephone network. And this act specifically created our good old friend, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which replaced the pre-existing Federal Radio Commission. And the law also, remember, as I said previously, the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, originally was in charge of regulating the phone network in addition to the railroad network. Well, the Communications Act of 1934 transferred regulatory control of the telephone network from the ICC to the FCC. Now, to give a little bit of background into why Bell Telephone had become a monopoly and why this act was necessary. So, after the expiration of Alexander Graham Bell's patent on the telephone in 1894, numerous companies sprung up offering phone service in America. Now, by 1913, Bell Telephone had slowly bought up almost all its competitors, because once again, with the telephone network, we're dealing with a network, the infrastructure building the actual telephone lines. And so Bell Telephone had become a natural monopoly in this space. Now, in 1913, there was some initial attempts made to regulate Bell. Specifically, the Kingsbury Committee attempted to force Bell Telephone to share their network with their competitors. However, this backfired because the committee only required Bell to share its long-distance service with local competitors. So there were both local telephone lines as well as long-distance lines that various telephone companies had built. Bell, even though they owned these long-distance lines, was being required to share them with other companies. The problem was that they didn't. Bell, due to its market dominance and its financial resources, had built an extensive network of local telephone lines as well. And they weren't required to share these with their competitors. So they still had a massive advantage of being able to connect you to anybody far better than any of their competitors could, because they didn't have to share their extensive built-out local network. So the Kingsbury Committee didn't do anything to curb Bell's market dominance. And the committee was then later repealed by the Graham-Willis Act of 1921, and which undid this, ineffective but still attempt to regulate Bell. And Bell and AT&T's monopoly grew even stronger over the 1920s. So the key thing to understand about the Communications Act of 1934, its sort of major innovation legally, was that it extended the idea of common carriers from physical goods networks to communications or information networks. And as previously, common carriers had purely referred to companies that transported physical goods from place to place. But the Communications Act realized that that same legal framework and concept could apply to the idea of transporting a virtual good across an electronic network from place to place via, voice communication or via the transfer of information, which we see as the packets that traverse the internet. And the law also created two major classifications for networks: Title I and Title II. Title I networks are what are known as information services networks, and Title II networks are what are known as telecommunications networks. And crucially, for understanding this legal debate, Title II networks are subject to common carrier or net neutrality regulations. Title I networks are not. And to roughly sort of explain this, and it gets very wonky and complicated, but the rough idea was that telecommunications was sort of a neutral medium. You just had a network, in this case the phone lines, and you were just talking over them. That was the transmission, and the phone network was the physical medium that allowed for the transmission. And so that was the network, and the common carrier was sort of the raw data of the conversations. Now, information service networks, the idea is, so to understand why this was even a thing, since this predates computers, it's helpful to know that there actually, early on in the history of telephone lines, there were certain numbers you could dial where you would actually sort of call a primitive sort of almost search engine, or it almost would be like calling the library. You'd call a number and you would get information on like certain questions you had. It very much was like a primitive version of going to a website over the telephone line. This was viewed as what's known as an enhanced network service. You weren't just using the raw network. You'd kind of built something on top of the network. And so the idea was that raw uses of the network, common carrier. But if you're like enhancing the network in some way, now it's like a sort of different ball game, and you're sort of legally reset on your societal obligations, as it were. So, and I'll go into this a little more. This is where like it can kind of get a little wonky and confusing. So don't feel bad it can get a little hard to parse the subtle differences at times. So this legal state of affairs worked fairly well for several decades. However, computers and the burgeoning initial internet, which was known as the ARPANET, kind of threw a wrench into this legal regulatory framework. So, as I said, before the advent of computers, with the exception of like those information service numbers you would dial, the phone network was unambiguously a Title II telecommunications network engaged in the raw transmission of data. However, computers changed the nature of the network because they were capable of changing and modifying the raw data. There was now a Title I information services network running on top of the phone network. And we know this about computers, that their nature is to take in bits of information, and based on the contents of those bits, they deterministically, conditionally do different things based on the contents of those bits. So they don't just receive the data from the phone lines, they then in turn interpret and modify the data. And so now, so what this had created was there was a distinction now between the physical networks of cables that made up the phone network and the nature of the data that the network was transporting. Now, to try to sort of resolve the weird legal regulatory stuff that this new reality created, the FCC had what was known as the computer inquiries. There were 3 initial attempts by the FCC to establish computer network regulation in 1970, 1976, and 1985. And they established, which I've already alluded to a bit, but it's important in like telecom law, it's an important concept. They established the idea of basic network service versus enhanced network service. Basic network service is the raw transmission of data or packets on a computer network. And basic network service was established as a common carrier as far as it was subject to common carrier laws and regulations. And a provider of a basic network service had to allow the creators of enhanced network services, and examples of things like enhanced network services are like email or the World Wide Web. These providers of basic network service, because they were subject to common carrier regulations, had to provide access to their networks in a neutral fashion to people who had created novel new uses of the network, things like email or the internet. Now, here's some further legal distinctions about the rules that govern basic versus enhanced network service providers. A provider of a basic network service can't offer their own bundled enhanced network services unless they either allow competitors to offer enhanced services on their networks, offer an unbundled basic service package where they just let you have access to their network and you don't have to buy their own personal enhanced network service offerings, or their enhanced services are offered by a structurally separated, independent financial entity. And finally, the computer inquiries most importantly established that being an internet service provider, an ISP, is itself providing enhanced network service. This is, as I said, it gets a little confusing, but you have to remember, the internet is not the same thing as the network of phone lines the internet runs on. The internet itself is an enhanced network service. So, this key distinction between the physical network itself and the internet, the thing running on the network, is what allowed for the success of the internet. It's what allowed for anyone to jump on the network, and if they had a great idea, do it. And established players couldn't say, oh, you're not allowed to use the network in this way. Sorry. Now, the next big sort of legal chapter in this history comes with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This was a massive overhaul of the 1934 Communications Act. It was intended to try to sort of catch the law up with the emerging legal realities of not just an internet that was connecting universities and scholars, but increasingly the entire planet, and was subject to a great deal of commerce now as well. Now, it does a ton of stuff, the Telecommunications Act, but I'm going to zero in on what's important for this talk. So what it specifically did was it codified in law that dial-up or DSL services delivered over phone lines were subject to Title II Common Carrier regulations that govern all phone-based communications. Critically, it classified cable services under a new title, Title III, and they weren't subject to common carrier regulations. So, this is something not everybody knows, but basically broadband internet delivered over cable is governed by a different legal regulatory framework than dial-up or DSL service. Specifically, broadband internet on cable is not subject to this basic versus enhanced services distinction of ISPs over phone lines. So what this resulted in is the loss of open access. You may remember, way back at the beginning of my talk, I was talking about two ways to achieve net neutrality: open access and broadband discrimination. So, in the early internet, the early public internet, we actually had a lot of what we call open access, where you may remember, if you're an early user of the internet back in the 90s, there were dozens of small internet service providers. Now there's only a few big players. This is largely a result of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, because broadband cable providers under the new law weren't required to give independent internet service providers access to their networks through local exchange carriers. This is very analogous to the scenario where Bell Telephone was not required to give its competitors access to their networks. And what this resulted in was the massive consolidation of the ISP marketplace, where only ISPs that were owned by the major cable companies and the ones that actually legally owned the vast majority of the networks were able to succeed. You no longer could have a little independent ISP provide access to the internet because they didn't own most of the cables and they weren't required by law to be given access to the cables. So small independent ISPs who couldn't afford to build their own networks mostly went extinct. And as I said earlier, even a major multinational like Google has found the rollout of their own ISP extremely difficult due to not being able to access existing cable lines. Now we get to Tim. We're kind of now to the point. It was in this environment that Tim Wu sort of wrote his paper, with the loss of open access and the loss of these independent ISPs, and why he started arguing for the need for broadband discrimination, which is usually what we think of when we think of net neutrality. He argued in his paper that if net neutrality from open access could no longer be achieved legally due to the 1996 Act, broadband discrimination could achieve the same effect. If enhanced service providers can't have direct access to the network itself except through the offerings of the broadband provider must not put restrictions on what Title I information services providers who use their ISP are allowed to do with their internet access. And to understand, once again, the environment that was going on when Tim Wu wrote his paper and why he was very concerned about that, that the big broadband players were able to set all these rules about how you were allowed to use the internet connection they would give you. A lot of people may not remember, although probably in this call a lot of people do, but in the early 2000s, many now common internet applications and practices were restricted and not allowed by major player ISPs. And these restrictions violated net neutrality and consumer innovation. And some of these restrictions included things like sharing an internet connection with more than one computer in your house, running your own server, running a VPN, running a BitTorrent client. A lot of fairly common accepted uses of the internet you as a independent user would not be allowed to do by your ISP. And that's why we believe broadband discrimination was necessary to combat this stifling of consumer innovation. Now, to play devil's advocate for a second, the major broadband providers have often justified many of their actions by arguing that they need to maximize their profits to increase investment and rollout of the broadband network. To quote Ed Whitaker, former CEO of SBC, he's on the record as saying, "Why should they be allowed to use my pipes? The internet can't be free in that sense because we and the cable companies have made an investment. And for a Google or Yahoo or Vonage or anybody to expect to use these pipes for free is nuts." And once again, to continue playing devil's advocate, there are certain potential arguments you can make that are sort of in favor of the right to discriminate based on packet content. So as I said, they already justify many of their actions by saying that they needed to maximize their profits due to the immense expense of building out the broadband network. Now, Tim Wu in his paper, while he disagrees with the ISP's discriminatory practices, he does argue that open access isn't truly as neutral as its advocates sometimes claim, that the structure, the physical structure of the network itself, and the nature of the TCP/IP protocol disfavor uses of the network that are latency sensitive. So TCP/IP, the protocol, there is no what's known as quality of service guarantee that applications such as streaming video can have their packets prioritized. You may have heard this referred to as internet fast lanes, which you could argue leaves them at a competitive disadvantage. The product they're offering, streaming video, requires a low latency network, and TCP/IP, its routing prioritization rules don't guarantee. There's no way in TCP/IP to say, I want these packets prioritized to be delivered first, and I'm willing to pay to do it. There are certain protocols that allow for things like that have a quality of service option, but TCP/IP doesn't. And you could fairly argue that something that is latency sensitive, like streaming video, doesn't work and without this sort of guarantee, and you could be left at a competitive disadvantage. Now, on the other hand, people who are for open access and net neutrality have pointed out, though, that if we weren't forcing the network, that if we forced the network itself to be a common carrier instead of the providers of service on the network to be common carriers, in other words, if we allowed open access and not just broadband discrimination, we would then have a diversity of different ISPs that could serve different customers with different needs. In other words, if we had open access and anybody could start an ISP, well, you could have an ISP that specifically marketed itself as providing paid fast lanes for low latency applications, and this would no longer be a problem in this world because the consumer can easily choose between dozens of competing ISPs and pick the one that serves their needs. Now, to start trying to get us to the present and wrap this up, because this talk was originally designed for a longer time frame, and I'm trying to keep us from going too long here, hence why I've talked a little faster than I sometimes give this talk. But the lead up to where we are now. So the FCC largely agreed with Tim Wu that net neutrality at the application layer was needed, and attempted to force companies like Comcast to stop these practices. So the FCC took people like Comcast to court to try to say you have to allow net neutrality, you can't discriminate based on packet type, etc. But the courts told the FCC that as long as cable companies' ISP offerings were classified as Title I information services, these services weren't subject to common carrier regulations. Only Title II telecommunications services were. So to get around this problem, in 2015, the FCC under Chairman Tom Wheeler classified internet service as a Title II common carrier service. Now we get to our current FCC chair, Ajit Pai, who you may have gathered I'm not a huge fan of, but I'm trying to be as impartial as I can. So what happened when Ajit Pai became the FCC chair? Well, he reversed Tom Wheeler's classification of internet service. He changed it from being a Title II service back to a Title I service. Excuse me. Now, this may seem a little wonky to you. Why can back-to-back FCC chairs just willy-nilly reclassify internet service how it's legally defined? Well, they can do that because of a 2005 Supreme Court case, colloquially known as the Brand X decision, which argued that federal agencies have full discretion in interpreting how to apply ambiguous laws unless an appeals court rules the law unambiguous. So this is a legal concept known as Chevron deference. It's the basic idea that if Congress passes a law, that a federal agency is supposed to carry out the implementation of this law. If there are parts of the law that don't explicitly spell out how something is supposed to be done or regulated, then the federal agency, in this case the FCC, has discretion or Chevron deference to decide what that part of the law means until an appeals court has weighed in and said, no, this actually means that. So because an appeals court and Congress have never formally hashed out the exact rules governing what makes something a telecommunications service or an information service, they've never fully hashed this law out. The law in many ways doesn't anticipate modern things like the internet and is still written in a framework dating all the way back to the Communications Act in 1934, there's a lot of ambiguity about how you can interpret some of these classifications. So the FCC chair can basically classify them how he wants. And now Pai has argued his justification for why the internet should be a Title I service and not an information service, not a communication service. He's argued this is because end users of the internet request websites without caring about things like an IP address or where the web server is physically located. So he's basically claiming that, well, people don't care about the actual physical internet. They care about the information they can get on the internet, which to be fair to him, he's not entirely wrong here. In fact, as I've been sort of explaining to you, the internet is an enhanced network service. One can argue correctly in a lot of senses because, the network is not the same thing. The physical network is not the same thing as the uses of the network. So he's not entirely out on a limb and arguing that, maybe the internet should be a Title I and not a Title II service. But his particular argument here is a little silly because, of course, most end users of the phone network call people and don't care about where a network endpoint is physically located either. And then, my slides get a little snarky and say that this seems like a flaw in reasoning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Pai has also argued, he's also raised sort of the broadband investment canard that the ISPs often raise, arguing that Title II regulations are preventing the expansion of the broadband network. Of course, this ignores the massive expansion of the internet that took place back in the 1990s when far stricter open access regulations were in place. It's also an example of what's known as a broken window fallacy, where Pai is ignoring the cost to users of the internet when he removes open access and net neutrality. In other words, he just looks at the costs of building out the internet and doesn't look at the costs of the lost business and innovation when he puts these restrictions on how people can use the internet. I mean, and this goes back to the original 1850 paper that coined the broken window fallacy. But I mean, the quickest way you could spur broadband investment would be to literally destroy all the cables and wires of the internet and start over building the entire thing again. Obviously, this would be very counterproductive, though. So Pai, in a lot of his arguments, is once again making these mistakes of muddying what are networks, what is access to networks, and what are enhanced uses of networks. And so to start trying to wrap this thing up, what are some of my thoughts on how we can sort of restore freedom to innovate and freedom to use the internet as we want? Well, first of all, I would say we should actually bring back open access. That net neutrality via broadband discrimination doesn't go far enough. It would be nice if we had lots of competing ISPs offering us different services based on our needs, and if anybody could decide that they want to provide access to the internet. Common carrier regulations, they've worked well in numerous areas at securing public good and innovation. They worked for the internet when we had them, and I believe they would work again. Currently, consumers are at the mercy of a few big ISPs and their practices, and bringing back open access and making the physical network a publicly accessible good again, it would give consumers the market power to punish bad actors by switching to competing services. And Some other options we could look into. We could invest in research to bring down the network's infrastructure costs. If we could make it where it wasn't so expensive to build out the internet, we could render it no longer a natural monopoly. And I will say that I think some of the things that are going on in Web 3.0 hint in this direction. There's lots of interesting things. People are experimenting with things like mesh networks and 5G access points. But there's a lot of interesting ideas about how we may eventually make it so the internet is no longer a natural monopoly because it's not so expensive to build it. And finally, and this also really taps into the Web 3.0 project, but the more we push for a decentralized peer-to-peer network at both the physical and application layers of the internet, the less we concentrate power in a few big players' hands. And that pretty much wraps up the slides of my talk. So I just kind of conclude here with stay vigilant, cyberpunks, and keep fighting to make the internet the wonderful, free, expressive place we all know and love. And I guess we will see if there are any questions, and I can field those with what time we have left. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to either write them in the chat window or in the Ask a Question section. But I guess I'll ask one quick question, Kevin. So,
sure thing.
People listening, how could we get involved with what you're talking about or help out the effort?
I mean, there's a number of things you can do. First of all, so as I said, EFF Austin, if you're based in Austin and want to get involved with us, traditionally I would tell you come to our meetups, which are traditionally at Capital Factory on the second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. That being said, those are probably going to be virtual for at least the next several months, but I encourage you to follow those as well. The best way to keep track of our events is we have a meetup page. You can follow us on Meetup. Also, if you're on Facebook or Twitter, we have a Facebook page and a Twitter. We also have a mailing list, and we have a website. You can go to effaustin.org. Probably the current place I'm most active in sharing articles and posting news is our Facebook group. So not just our Facebook page, but we have a group as well. It has a pretty lively little community where I and a number of other people share quite a few articles on this topic. That's a good thing to do, especially since the physical meetings are not in place right now. You're also just welcome to reach out and email us either at our info@effaustin.org, or you can email me personally at kevin.welch@effaustin.org. But we're always looking for volunteers and people who want to get involved in the cause. We're very much a low-budget, community-driven, talent-run organization. So what we do really comes down to where your talents lie and what you want to do. But traditionally, we've really been in the education space. We also occasionally throw cool parties and events, and we often have pretty cool guests who are big speakers in these topics. We do a bit on the legislative advocacy wrangling bit. We have advised lawmakers in the Texas legislature on certain bills they proposed about how to improve them. So if that's something you're interested in, it's something we do as well. Also, of course, I recommend going to the EFF website itself. And certainly, if you have limited funds, you should give money to EFF. I mean, we'd love your money as well, but if you're limited in funds, you should donate to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And they have a whole bunch of resources educating you on this stuff, as well as various campaigns to get involved in. And a lot of it, can boil down to just contacting who your senators, who your representatives are, and letting them know you care about these issues and how you want them to vote. One thing we've done as well is for both local politicians and people who are running for office, we've talked to them and tried to educate them about what we think some good tech policy would be. I mean, it's really a cause with diverse ways to get involved, and it really comes down to what you're interested in, what your skill set is. But yeah, we encourage you to get involved in the fight because there's a lot going on right now in this space. Everybody is rightfully a bit distracted with the chaos in the world right now, but there are some very scary proposals being made around certain things relating to digital privacy right now. And so this fight doesn't end. Like, Specifically, I would draw your attention to something working its way through the Senate called the EARNIT Act, which EFF has a great write-up on the EARNIT Act and why it's a very bad, dangerous law. But to basically summarize, it's the government, their latest attempt in a long line of bills to try to get rid of end-to-end encryption and have government backdoors in all internet communications, though they're being a little sneakier and cleverer in how they're trying to accomplish it this time. So that's a big one. If you want to yell at your lawmaker that they better not vote for that, that is certainly a low effort but high value thing you can do. But yeah, I mean, just reach out. We'd love your help.
Cool. Yeah, and I can kind of get some links together too for people in a follow up.
Absolutely.
The EARNIT.
Oh, and also, I guess I should ask Drake. And for those who have found, for those who leave today and are a little more curious about who is this Polkadot? What are they up to? Well, Dan here is going to be speaking at our virtual meetup next month on the second Tuesday of April. Exact details of which platform and how we'll be presenting him to be hashed out in the next week or so, but stay tuned for that.
It looks like we have a few questions here on the right, Kevin.
Okay, let me look through them. Bill, if one views the blockchain efforts by the consortium IBM has set up as creating information service, should that be a test case for a new shot getting net neutrality for all? Well, Bill, I will admit that I've not done a deep dive yet into IBM's blockchain consortium. If you want, I can't probably on the spot speak in any way beyond just kind of BSing out my ass on that just because I'm not that familiar with it. But if you want to follow up with me after this and send me some links on exactly what they're doing, I'd be happy to follow up this discussion with you and see what I think about that. I mean, I would think it might be I could see lots of blockchain efforts being just by their very decentralized nature. I could see them being good test pilots for certain legal frameworks that might allow us to push a bit back on the current regulatory framework. And let's see, for Amazon users, yes, I believe that is correct, that EFF is a charity recipient on Amazon Smile. At least I'm pretty sure they are last time I checked. So yeah, if you want a low effort way to give them some money when you're shopping, that's one way to do it. Let's see, Bill's other questions. Are there any countries that have multiple vendors providing telecom services or multiple vendors and information services? I mean, I will admit I'm a little less knowledgeable about these exact legal frameworks in other countries. It should be clear this whole talk is very much related to the history of all this stuff in the United States. I remember one time when I gave this talk, somebody in the audience had a lot of experience installing telecom infrastructure all over the world, including in places like Eastern Europe and the Philippines. And definitely a lot of this stuff legally and all this history doesn't apply in those places, to the point that he thought that a lot of my proposals, like, he disagreed with them and thought there were different legal ways we should handle this stuff just because the history in these other places was so different than how things have proceeded here in the US. I mean, I do believe that there are countries that do have more ISP diversity than the United States, but as I just said, it's not something I have researched super extensively, so I don't want to definitively say yay or nay. And once again, as I said, these proposals and the situation we find ourselves in with lots of ISPs or only a few ISPs is very much related to the structure of US law. In other words, based on how the law works in other countries, whether they do or don't have a lot of ISPs, it wouldn't necessarily be relevant in a US context just because, well, our laws work differently and we have to figure out a way to achieve what we want within that framework. Let's see what else we got here. And mass investment worldwide over $1 trillion in 2021 for 5G. So this topic should really be pursued for the future of the fourth industrial age. I mean, yes, absolutely. With the coming 5G network built off the fiber backbone, yeah, I mean, that is actually an interesting initial step with the 5G access points and smart networks and smart cities and whatnot, that we're going to look at a vastly more decentralized internet. There will still be the fiber backbones, but it's going to be a move towards a much less centralized internet. And I do think it does present an opportunity where we can try to get some of these laws to a more equitable place, just by virtue of controlling a network like that. While yes, there's still the backbone, which is, a big elephant in the room, but there are more opportunities to wrest more control for the end user in a more noded out world, as it were. I would think so, at least anyway.
So I think that's about it. I know Kathy had one question. Will you be having more of these online meetups? So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, Polkadot, I mean, we probably both will. I mean, Polkadot, yeah. And I'll say, Dan, if any of these meetups you guys do is on a topic that would probably be EFF Austin adjacent, you're always welcome to forward that to me, and I can share it with our people.
Perfect. So yeah, we'll send a link to Kevin's online events coming up, and then Kathy, if you were interested in Polkadot events, you can, probably the best would be actually to follow us on Crowdcast, and then you'll be able to check the schedule and get notified of any upcoming events.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions, or does that tap us out?
We got about 4 minutes to spare in the hour, so perfect. I think that's about it. So thanks, Kevin. Thanks everybody for joining the call.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
In the meantime, and we'll send out some resources and links for you afterwards.
Yes, and if anybody wants a copy of my slides, or if you're just being polite and don't want to take up a ton of time, but there was some part of it that you found confusing for whatever reason, I'd be happy to send you some of the very technical legal briefs I read through to prepare that talk that probably explain some of these concepts a little better than my half-formed summary. So I'm happy to send that out to anybody who's interested. But yeah, thank you all for coming. I hope this was a decently educational, informative, fun way to spend part of your quarantine today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you all so much.